in the entire country. They were, their treatment services were very limited, and would I come as both as a professional in the field to visit places and to talk to groups, and I spoke at a couple of universities. One of the places I went was a large sanitarium, not unlike the kind of sanitariums. I think this is the New York State inebriate asylum in the mid 1800s, and they had, Kazakhstan has a number of large sanitariums like that. And so one of the places I went was in the city of Karaganda, Kazakhstan, and this large treatment center for alcoholics and heroin addicts almost exclusively. And I took with me, as I visited, a young man I had met named Boris, and Boris was a member of this fledgling AA group in Karaganda. And I think there at that point were maybe 15, 20 members. They had gotten a hold of a copy of the book Alcoholics Anonymous in Russian and started to read it, and this little infant group began. Well, I took Boris with me. Boris had, I think, less than 8 weeks of continuous sobriety. And I came, and I was the visiting American, and as you might imagine, Kazakhstan is one of those countries where people don't go there like a tourist. So no one goes there. So when I showed up, they were pretty excited. And everywhere I went, people, they'd roll out the red carpet and people would dress up. And so I'm talking to the medical director of this very large sanitarium, and in our conversation, I make mention that I brought this young man, Boris, with me, this Russian kid. And I explained who Boris was, and at a certain point in time, this medical director stopped paying attention to me and began to talk very excitedly to Boris. He was much more interested in finding out what was Boris's story than he was in talking to this visiting American. And at first I didn't know what happened. And I then talked with my translators, and I found out that Boris had actually been in this facility a number of times over the years. And this was the first time this medical director had ever met someone who had gone through his treatment program who had more than 30 days of continuous sobriety. And I tell that story because that's what the United States was like prior to 1935. That really, it's important to know that the landscape of recovery in the United States prior to the inception of Alcoholics Anonymous was people went into institutions and they came out of institutions and they drank and they, for the most part, died. So that's important to know. There were lots of inebriate asylums around the country like this in the 1850s, 1860s. They eventually went out of fashion. Over the years, there have been various ways of trying to treat alcoholics. In the 30s, shock treatment, and in fact, in Kazakhstan, they were still using cold baths and shock treatment, and really looked like the old 1930s insane asylums in the United States. Anybody know where the first Skid Row mission was founded? Any ideas?
Chicago?
Anybody know why they call it Skid Row?
Seattle.
Hmm?
Seattle.
Seattle, that's right. Loggers, right? Places where they would skid the logs down, right? Skid Row missions were early religious missions were common ways of treating alcoholics in the early days. How many of you know who the Washingtonians are? About 2 hands. Okay. Well, that's something because this was the largest sobriety movement other than Alcoholics Anonymous in the history of the United States. Right? Founded in 1840 in Maryland at a tavern. Those 6 men got together and decided they were going to start a temperance movement. Right? They thought they had this grand idea of how they were going to get themselves sober and they were going to get other people sober. And by God, they did. They got themselves sober and they became an organization that grew exponentially. It not only did it ultimately have somewhere in the neighborhood of 600,000 recovering alcoholics, but at the peak of its existence, it had more than 6 million Americans who were members. Abraham Lincoln was a member of the Washingtonians. So does it surprise you at all that you've never heard of it? Well, it should. It surprised Bill Wilson, too, when he heard about it, because he figured that if anybody would know about it, he would. In fact, this organization bloomed and grew at a fantastic rate over about a 6 to 8 year period. By 1848, it was completely disappeared from history. One of the things that, a lot of what happened was that these alcoholic egos involved got grand ideas about making money and setting up hospitals and making big temperance movements in the United States. And eventually, if you look at, I'm going to talk a little bit later about the traditions of Alcoholics Anonymous, the traditions that Bill Wilson put forth in AA were largely based on the mistakes these men made. And not only did the thing cease to exist and really vanish from history, but the alcoholics involved, these men all died drunk. Right? So, and Bill Wilson learned a lesson from watching these men that there were serious dangers associated with getting sober, with how one handled their recovery. So, but it's an amazing story. All right. Rowland Hazard. Rowland Hazard was from a very wealthy Rhode Island family, and he was a bad alcoholic. And Rowland Hazard, his family eventually despaired over his drunkenness and decided to send him to the best place on earth to get help for his drinking. Where do you think they sent him?
Switzerland.
Well, yes, ultimately. They sent him to see Sigmund Freud. This is the first of what I call seconds and inches stories in Alcoholics Anonymous. They sent him to see Sigmund Freud, who was the most renowned psychotherapist in the world at the time. And Sigmund Freud was too busy to see him. And instead said, why don't you go and see Carl Jung? Now, believe me, if Rowland Hazard had ended up seeing Sigmund Freud, we'd probably be having a pretty different conversation, right? Because the differences between Freud and Jung are profound. Carl Jung was an experiential psychotherapist. He believed in mystical event. He believed in spirituality. I actually have a plaque in my office that is a copy of what was in his office, and it's the Latin phrase translated, bidden or unbidden, God is present. Freud was very different from Carl Jung. And Carl Jung met with Rowland Hazard and eventually got to the point where he said, you know, I think you're hopeless. I think you're kind of hopeless. I think your best bet is to find some kind of profound spiritual experience for yourself. Find some relationship with a power greater than yourself. And as a result of that encounter, Rowland Hazard connected with the Oxford group probably while he was still in Switzerland. The Oxford group was a religious movement that really was all over the world. It certainly had its center in the United States and actually has a Michigan connection. If you ever go to Mackinac Island, the theater on Mackinac Island was owned by the Oxford groups. One of the few sort of vestiges of this organization. The Oxford group was founded by this guy, Frank Buchman, who was an evangelist from Pennsylvania. And he wanted to create what he called a first century church. This was an informal meeting of like-minded people that developed these groups, and sometimes affiliated with churches, often affiliated with Anglican churches. It had something of a reputation of being associated with people who had some means. It was very common in the 30s for Oxford group meetings to be pretty well-heeled folks. And so that's where Rowland Hazard did. He hooked up with the Oxford group and he got sober. He had a religious experience with them. He got sober. Interestingly enough, though he played a role in the founding of Alcoholics Anonymous, he never joined AA. He did die sober. Rowland Hazard went to another drinking buddy of his named Ebby Thacher. And I'll talk more later about Ebby. Ebby Thacher was a beloved figure in the history of Alcoholics Anonymous. He was a drinking buddy of Rowland Hazard. He was a drinking buddy of Bill Wilson. And if you read in the book Alcoholics Anonymous, there's a story about Ebby Thacher coming to visit Bill Wilson and describing to him that he'd gotten, quote, gotten religion. Rowland had taken Ebby to the Oxford groups, and Ebby had sobered up briefly. And I think he was about 2 months sober when he came to see Bill. And he was excited, and he you know, one can imagine he sat in the kitchen with Bill and told him about this religious experience that he had. And Bill was not very excited about this. Now, Bill Wilson was a very, very interesting guy. Born in East Dorset, Vermont. Actually, I'm going to skip ahead. I'll come back. Born in East Dorset, Vermont, his father went away on business one day when he was young and never came back. His mother decided to become a physician, and she went away, and she, for the most part, never came back. So Bill was raised by his grandparents. Now, Bill Wilson was a brilliant guy. He had his moments. He flunked out of law school because he was drunk and never did get a law degree. But he became a stock speculator. But he eventually, as a result of his drinking, he pretty much lost everything. He had become very successful on Wall Street for a while, but eventually became so unreliable and so erratic that no one would hire him. And that's where Ebby Thacher found him. Shortly after Bill Wilson talked to Ebby Thacher, he ended up there, Towns Hospital. You can still go to New York City, and Towns Hospital is still there. He had been there a number of times. He'd been in Skid Row missions. He'd been in other kinds of institutions. He had what we call late-stage alcoholism, so that when he detoxed, he had hallucinations and tremors, and I don't know if he had seizures, but he had really, really grave alcoholism. And it was shortly before his final trip to Towns Hospital that he came across Ebby Thacher. And Ebby encouraged him to seek out some kind of a spiritual relationship. Well, the spiritual relationship sort of sought Bill out instead. Bill ended up strapped down, 4-point restraints at Towns Hospital. And we don't really know that much about what the treatment of choice was at the time, but we know that they commonly used belladonna, and so we have no idea what state Bill was in at the time. But sometime during the night, one of his nights of detox, Bill Wilson had what he called a white light experience. He wrote about it, and he described that his hospital room filled up with light. He felt a peace come upon him, and apparently slept soundly. And he described it as this sort of seminal event in his life. It was November of 1934. And this guy, William Silkworth, Silky, was the attending physician at Towns Hospital for treating these alcoholics. And he came in the next morning, and Bill Wilson excitedly told him about this experience that he had. And Silkworth sort of nodded knowingly and said, okay, right? Now it's funny, if it had happened today, I'm sure they would have medicated him pretty aggressively. But Silkworth was a pretty smart guy. And Silkworth said something along the lines of, it's better than what you had. If you had some experience that was transformative to you, I recommend you run with it. And really, to his credit, if you look at the book Alcoholics Anonymous, the so-called doctor's opinion in the book was written by William Silkworth. And he played a very key role in the development of Alcoholics Anonymous. Now I'm going to back up, because I want to talk about this guy. William James was a psychologist and is generally recognized to be one of the fathers of American psychiatry. William James was a very, very interesting guy. He wrote extensively on the subject of people having so-called mystical experiences. He wrote a book, and this is one of those enigmatic aspects of AA. He wrote a book called The Varieties of Religious Experience. I have a copy. I've attempted to read it more than once. I know very smart people. I'm a pretty smart person. I think it was the turn of the century wrote this, 1901, I think. And I know quite a few people who are very intelligent who have never been able to successfully make it through the varieties of religious experience. Now, I share that because Bill Wilson read this book and it transformed him, right? And there are a number of us who aren't sure exactly how that happened, right? But Bill Wilson saw this book as a linchpin in his understanding of spiritual experiences, and it informed him for the rest of his life. I wish I could tell you. I looked for what he saw in it. It's a very dense book. The James brothers were packed prose is a good way to describe it. So Bill Wilson walked out of Towns Hospital in November of 1934, a transformed man. And these, people get sober in a sort of mystical way. People have religious experiences. That's one way that alcoholics get better. And he went out, he went out into the world deciding that he was going to share this good news. He had a certain kind of evangelistic zeal about him. And he started telling people about this profound spiritual experience he had and how important it was. Along the way, he came across Harry Tiebout. And Harry Tiebout was a psychiatrist who was a very interesting guy who played a fairly key role in kind of transforming Bill. Tiebout was the person who originally told Bill that perhaps his evangelistic zeal was not the best approach, that perhaps telling his story was a better idea. Tiebout also came up with a concept that became very important to Bill, what was called the deflation of ego at depth. Bill Wilson was once asked years later if there was a shortened version of what Alcoholics Anonymous meant. And he said, let me see if I can remember this right, he said that alcoholic has to have a painful and traumatic experience. Second, they had to stay in the pain for the deflation of ego at depth, this idea of suppressing one's ego. Third, they had to choose humility. And fourth, they had to ask for help. And that those were the four ingredients of recovery. So Tiebout helped Bill understand this idea of surrender, of moving away from egocentric, of moving away from what we would now call empowerment, really. But Bill was evangelistic, and Bill wanted to go help other people. And so he went out and grabbed drunks. There's just he would find guys in bars and on the street, and he would bring them home. And there are lots of fairly notorious stories about him snagging alcoholics in New York City and bringing them back to his, let's skip ahead, bringing them back to here, 182 Clinton Street, their apartment with his wife Lois, his long-suffering wife Lois. And he would bring drugs. They'd stay at his house. And there, like I say, there are some fairly notorious stories. I believe at least 2 people died in his apartment. 2 alcoholics died in his apartment. They hit on Lois. They puked on his furniture. They robbed him. It was just terrible. And no one And I mean, no one got sober, not one. And for 6 months he did this. And it just brought, poor Lois, who had watched her husband decline into his alcoholism for years and years and years and had, really run their life into the ground. Now her husband got sober, and this was the result. He was bringing worse drunks than him home. And eventually, he finally despaired. He finally got to the point where he realized that this was going nowhere. And this is one of those stories, we were talking about it before we started. There are stories about Alcoholics Anonymous that appear to be apocryphal. There occasionally are stories about Alcoholics Anonymous that appear to be apocryphal that later, it turns out, are true, this is one of them. Because Bill Wilson eventually went to Lois and said, this isn't working, and I put you through enough, and I'm not going to do it anymore. I've tried to talk to all these drunkards, and no matter what I do, none of them stay sober. And Lois Wilson wagged her finger at Bill and said, don't you dare stop. You've stayed sober. You've stayed sober. And in that was a kernel of an idea that, in fact, that was true, that although none of the people he had worked with had been able to stop drinking, he'd been able to stay sober. And that became really one of the core concepts of Alcoholics Anonymous, the idea that what heals an alcoholic is working with a new person, working with somebody who's struggling, and that the benefit comes to the sober alcoholic who's working with the suffering one. Now I'm going to back up. A couple of people who played important roles, and I urge you to Google these guys, and there are many, many stories about them. Sam Shoemaker was an Episcopal priest at Calvary Episcopal Church. Bill Wilson called this man the third co-founder of AA. That's how important he was. And you can read up about him. He was an early member of the Oxford groups in the United States. He was a big supporter of religious ecumenism. Very, very interesting guy. He wrote wonderful, wonderful evocative poetry. Like I say, I could go on. We could spend a long time just talking about Sam Shoemaker, but really extraordinary man. Played a huge role in the early days of Alcoholics Anonymous. Next guy, this guy didn't, I put him earlier, but he didn't actually show up on the scene until after the founding of AA. Father Ed Dowling was a Jesuit priest, a little Jesuit priest from St. Louis. Walked with a cane, and he read about Alcoholics Anonymous and came to visit Bill Wilson in New York at the AA office in 1940. I include him because he's a key person in Bill's development. But he read about AA, and he was persuaded that Bill, in the development of the program of Alcoholics Anonymous, had obviously studied the teachings of St. Ignatius. And so he got on a train and he traveled from St. Louis to New York City, arriving in a rainstorm, and showed up at the downtown office of Alcoholics Anonymous. As the story goes, he walked into Bill's office and Bill thought he was a drunk. And then he took off his coat and he saw the clerical collar, and Bill realized he was a priest. Father Ed came up to him and said, I can tell by your writing that you know Ignatius. And Bill, is another one of those stories that you can't believe is really true, but it is. And Bill Wilson said to him, well, no, I can't say I know the man. Does he live in New York City? It's important because Ed Dowling came away, when Ed Dowling realized that Bill Wilson had never read a word of St. Ignatius, he became persuaded that Bill had had some kind of a mystical, he described Alcoholics Anonymous as a divinely inspired program. And for a long time I thought he was being rhetorical, but it turns out, I read a book recently, that he wasn't. He really felt like somehow something happened to Bill that allowed him particularly to pen the 12 Steps and to write some of the things that he wrote in the 164 pages of Alcoholics Anonymous that he sort of couldn't possibly have written. That I've had a little bit of that experience. Last year, it was mentioned I was on sabbatical. One of the places I went to Bill Wilson's birthplace, and I went to his gravesite. And I've read a lot about Bill Wilson, and there continue to be aspects of him that show up in the history of AA where I can't tell how this Yankee from Vermont traveled from point A to point B and became the kind of man that he was. It doesn't make a lot of sense to me. I'll share a story in a little while about him that's an example of that. Anybody questions so far? I'm moving through these slides. Yeah?
So when did AA exactly start? Like what year was that?
Great segue.
Okay.
79 years ago last week.
Okay.
Okay? And now we skip forward. Bill carried the message. So Lois said, don't stop talking to alcoholics. And Bill had gotten his head around the idea that talking to drunkards, talking to dipsomaniacs made him feel better. So he got that, right? And he had been sober for a while, and an opportunity fell on his doorstep, and he had the opportunity to go on this business trip as an emissary of one of these investment firms in Wall Street to participate in a hostile takeover of a rubber company. And so he traveled from New York to Akron, Ohio. And this was going to be his big break. This was a big deal. And not only he was going to negotiate this hostile takeover, he was going to be installed as the president of this new company. This was going to be he was finally going to get back into success as he knew it. And he went, and the business trip, the takeover fell apart. It went very, very badly. And not only did he not end up president of this company, the thing failed, and he found himself in that hotel. That's the Mayflower Hotel. It's still there. You could go there. It's kind of a dump right now. It's a rooming house now, but at the time it was a fairly regal hotel. But he found himself in the lobby, one floor up off the front door, the lobby of the Mayflower Hotel, and he didn't have enough money to get home. Right? And all his hopes that he pinned on this business trip were gone. And he began to despair. And he was in this lobby. That's a picture of the lobby as it was then. In that lobby, there's actually a replica of that church directory on the wall, and there's a replica of a payphone on the wall. Because he stood there, and off to one side there's a cocktail lounge, and he could hear the music playing, and he could hear the ice cubes tinkling in the glasses. And he said, you know, if I don't find a drunk, I'm going to drink. And so he went into the cocktail lounge and got $1 worth of nickels. And he looked on the church directory and he recognized the name of an Episcopal priest from Akron, Ohio, named Walter Tunks. And he called Walter Tunks and he said, I'm a drunkard from New York City and I need to talk to another drunkard. Can you put me in touch with somebody? Is there somebody with your church that drinks too much? Right? Now you picture that this is 1935, right? You call up a churchman, you know, call up a priest and say, I'm looking for somebody in your parish who's a drunkard. Right? Right. Well, Walter Tunks didn't know anybody, but he knew some people who might be helpful to Bill. And so he gave Bill a list of 10 names and numbers. Right? And so Bill's got a handful of nickels. Anybody know how many calls he made? Yeah. Walter Tunks gave him 10 names and phone numbers. Bill Wilson made 10 calls. Right? 10 calls. How many calls would you make? You know? We always say, as he was making each one of those calls, the world hung in the balance. And alcoholics, you know, look back at each nickel going in that phone. And it was the 10th phone call, where he came across this woman, Henrietta Seiberling, who you could argue was maybe the very first Al-Anon. And when he realized who it was, he was dismayed because Seiberling was a rubber family and he figured that this wasn't going to go very well. But Henrietta Seiberling was very excited to get his call. She was very excited to get his call. And because she knew she was friends with a woman named Annie Smith. And Annie Smith was married to a man named Robert Holbrook Smith, who was a beloved physician in town. He was actually a rectal surgeon, but it was a very, very bad alcoholic. And you can imagine that Akron, Ohio is full of stories about a drunken rectal surgeon. But Henrietta Seiberling brokered a meeting between Bill Wilson and Robert Holbrook Smith. Now, she had to broker it twice because the first time was Mother's Day, and Dr. Bob Smith was too drunk to attend. There was a joke that he'd come home with a potted plant, and he had gotten so potted that he was more potted than the plant. He was passed out under the kitchen table. Dr. Bob was not super excited about meeting this guy. But the next day, they gathered him together and carted him over to the gatehouse of the Seiberling property in order to meet this so-called reformed drunkard from New York City. And as he walked into the room, he turned to his wife Annie and said, "I'll give him 15 minutes." And they sat down in the Seiberling Gatehouse, and you can go there. This is a historical site now as well. And you can actually visit the gatehouse where these two men sat down. And Dr. Bob said, "I'll give him 15 minutes," and 6 hours later, they were still talking. 6 hours later. Something happened that Bill Wilson later articulated. Bill Wilson later said that something magical happened when one alcoholic talked to another alcoholic. He turned it the language of the heart. He said that there was a certain kind of magic that took place, and that alcoholics could talk to one another in ways that normal people couldn't. Though we were talking before that shortly after this encounter, Dr. Bob took his last drink. Generally speaking, Alcoholics Anonymous commemorates Dr. Bob's last drink and calls it the anniversary of Alcoholics Anonymous on June 10th, 1935. That's an example of a story that's probably not true, because there's pretty good evidence that Dr. Bob drank after that. And it's just sort of stuck. It's become a custom that June 10th, 1935 is considered to be that day. But it's unlikely that it's true. But what did happen was that Dr. Bob Smith got a sense of this recovery thing. And he was a character in his own right. Not only was he a drunken proctologist, but there's a local connection because he got kicked out of the University of Michigan Medical School. He ended up going to Rush in Chicago to get his medical degree because he couldn't make it here. And actually, one of the defining moments, I think, of Dr. Bob was that there's a story about how his father got a phone call from his fraternity brothers saying, "Please come get your son because he's drinking too much." And I think that may be a pure diagnosis of what you know you're an alcoholic when your fraternity brothers call your dad and say you're really drinking too much. That's a bad day. That's a bad sign. Well, these two guys, who were both from Vermont, they became fast friends. They were very, very different. Dr. Bob actually had been involved in the Oxford groups. It was very interesting. He was a fairly devout guy, but could not stay sober for the life of him. Until he hooked up with another alcoholic, he wasn't able to stay sober. Once he did get sober, he stayed sober for another 15 years until his death. But Bill was kind of an ambitious, kind of he was a stock speculator. He was very outgoing, even though he suffered from depression and other kinds of problems later in life especially. But Dr. Bob was a small town man. He was a small town doctor, and he had a very, very humble approach to life. There was a joke years ago that if Alcoholics Anonymous had been founded by Bill Wilson alone, it would have been a fast-rising and eventually would be a large organization that grew very quickly and then would cease to exist. And if it had just been started by Dr. Bob, it'd be a vital spiritual movement in about an 8-block radius in Akron, Ohio. That's how different those two men were. So they needed each other. And they contributed to one another. And they, I think Dr. Bob served as a kind of a governor for Bill Wilson. He was able to keep Bill Wilson focused. He died in 1950. As I say, he was 15 years sober. Bill, I think, never got over it. His wife Annie was a spiritual leader in the early days of Alcoholics Anonymous, and so when I mentioned this Amway without the money, as soon as Dr. Bob got sober, he said, "We got to get busy." He said, "We got to go find somebody else," and together they went and found AA number 3. Now, Bill Wilson moved in to this house, 855 Ardmore, Bill and Ann's, or Dr. Bob and Ann Smith's house. And Bill lived there for a couple of months. He didn't go back to New York for a while. And this, some years ago, was named a historical site. I think they bought it in the mid-'80s. And so it's a museum now, and you can arrange to go to Akron, Ohio and see this house. And every year around the June 10th date, there's something called Founders Day. The 79th anniversary of AA will be celebrated first week of June. And alcoholics come from all over the world. Dawn Farm has had some guests over the years from Japan. And one of the things that they always want to do is they have to make a pilgrimage to Akron, Ohio. They have to go to Dr. Bob's house. It's really funny. But people from all over the world have come to that house. So Bill lived there, and together, very quickly, within a few days, they went, where is it? They went to see this guy, Bill Dotson. Bill Dotson was a lawyer. He ended up a city council person in Akron, Ohio. Very successful guy, bad drunk. There's a story about him in the big book. He was called AA number 3. And that picture I showed at first, the picture of the man on the bed, is about Bill Dotson. And they went and told their story. They went and sat down with Bill Dotson and told their story. They came back the next day to see him, and he had thought that he'd hallucinated it. He told his wife, he said, "Oh, they were real. Those guys were real." He got sober June 26, 1935, and never took another drink until his death. And he was an important part of Alcoholics Anonymous in Akron, Ohio. He and his wife were mainstays along with Dr. Bob and Ann. Now, when did he die? I think he was almost 20 years sober when he died. Now, St. Thomas Hospital was an important place. It was where Dr. Bob worked, and it's where this woman worked, Sister Ignatia, who was a very important part of the early days of Alcoholics Anonymous in Akron. Sister Ignatia was in charge of admissions at St. Thomas Hospital. And they didn't like admitting alcoholics for obvious reasons. And so Dr. Bob and Sister Ignatia and another physician on the staff of this hospital worked out a secret admission plan. And they surreptitiously admitted alcoholics to this hospital, many of them, under basically fraudulent diagnoses in order to, and they ended up setting aside a ward that was entirely alcoholics. And she is still considered, in Akron especially, to be a very, very important, if you go to Founders Day, they'll have a picture of Bob and a picture of Bill Wilson and a picture of her, because she was so important to the early development of recovery in Akron, Ohio. They held their first meetings in homes, and they hadn't called it AA. They just called it, at first it was an Oxford group meeting. They eventually got big enough that they had a meeting, the very first meeting in Akron, Ohio was at King's School. Although even when it was at King's School, they didn't call it AA. Little local, how many of you know who Archie Trowbridge was? Really? Not, almost nobody. Okay. This is an important guy. I don't remember what his story is called now in the Alcoholics Anonymous book. It used to be called The Man Who Mastered Fear. Archie Trowbridge was from Grosse Pointe, Michigan. He was a shirt salesman. He used to sell dress shirts door to door. He was tremendously shy. He was phobically shy. But he went to Akron, Ohio in November of 1938 and stayed in Bob and Ann's house and with this new movement of recovering people and got sober and was one of the earlier members of Alcoholics Anonymous. He then came back to Detroit and despite being, as I say, phobically shy, became the face of Alcoholics Anonymous in Detroit for a long time. In addition to holding meetings and speaking, he would go on the radio. He used to go on the radio station in the Fisher Building on Saturday nights and tell his story. He did all these things that were very, very difficult for him. But and people say, well, how did Alcoholics Anonymous get to Detroit? That's how. Now I will say, people say, well, how did Alcoholics Anonymous get to Ann Arbor? For a long time I thought it came through Archie Trowbridge. Turns out it's not true. Just as an aside, Alcoholics Anonymous came to Ann Arbor because there were two alcoholics in Ann Arbor who had heard about AA, and both of them wrote New York separately. And they both got big books. They both got literature, and they were given each other's names to contact each other. And they did contact each other, and they met, and they started a meeting. And within less than a year, there was a conflict in the group. And half the group went one direction, and half the group went another direction. And they encouraged people not to go to the other group. Right? And there's a running joke in Alcoholics Anonymous that the only thing you need to start an AA meeting is a coffee pot and a resentment. And this was Ann Arbor was the first example of that, because one of these groups was known as the so-called spiritual group, and one of the groups was known as the so-called social group. They talk about sports and stuff. And the sports people said, oh, you don't want to go to the spiritual group. And the spiritual group said, you don't want to go to the sports group. It's a classic Alcoholics Anonymous story. But it turns out it had nothing to do with Detroit AA. Detroit started. One other story that may, in fact, I've never been able to get it checked out, but may be related to Archie Trowbridge, is most of the meetings of Alcoholics Anonymous around the country are lead meetings, like you may have seen in the movies, where people get up at a podium and they speak, and then maybe people will raise their hands and share, or they'll come up to a podium and speak. Most of the AA meetings in Michigan are discussion meetings. And I have heard people theorize that Archie Trowbridge, because he was so shy, encouraged people to just sit at a table and talk. And in fact, most of the meetings in the state of Michigan are precisely like that. I don't know if it's true, but it might be true. So, any questions so far? Amway without the money. First there were 2, then there were 3, then there were 5, then there were 10. And this movement that still didn't have a name began to form. They decided that they needed to write a book, that the only way that they could disseminate this program to others was to write this book. And in order to do it, they needed money. Right? So at the time, where would you go for money? Well, you'd go to this guy. What? John Rockefeller. You know, and he was the wealthiest man they knew of. And they went to him. A number of them, of the early AA members, went to John Rockefeller, and they asked him for $50,000, and they figured that he was certainly capable of giving it to them. And not only did he not give it to them, he agreed to loan them $5,000. He said, you guys need to keep money out of this thing, otherwise you're just going to ruin it. And so he loaned them $5,000 on the condition that they pay him back pretty quickly. And I'm pretty sure I have a picture in here. Yeah, there are the canceled checks of them paying John Rockefeller back. And that principle about money continues to this day. There are a number of organizational principles of Alcoholics Anonymous that one could argue make no sense. This is one of them. If you're not a member of Alcoholics Anonymous, but you think AA does great work and you write them a check for $100, they'll send your check back. They accept no donations from outside sources at all. And there are some limits, even if you are a member of Alcoholics Anonymous, as to how much money that you can give to AA in New York before they'll turn you down. They really eschew money, even though they do have expenses. So with this $5,000 and with input from the early community of recovering people, they wrote this book. Anybody know what the book was originally called? It was originally called A Way Out, but that title was taken, so they couldn't use it. So they called it Alcoholics Anonymous, and there are various stories about why they came up with that name. But April 10th, 1939, they published this book, affectionately referred to as the Big Book. You know why it's called the Big Book?
Because it was big.
Anybody?
Because it was big.
They felt like alcoholics would need to be sure that they were getting real value for their money. And so, it's a true story. And so they printed it on the heaviest weight paper that they could get. And indeed, the first edition of the Big Book is a really thick, and it's just because the paper is really heavy, right? But they figured if they were going to get people to send in their money to buy this book, it had to have some heft associated with it. And just in the last 5 or so years, they published an annotated version of the original manuscript, the original 164 pages of the Big Book. If you get a chance to see it, you ought to take a look at it. It's extraordinary to see how various members of this group played roles in developing the narrative of this book, particularly the first 164 pages, which is considered to be the text of AA. It's written in classic 1930s kind of Damon Runyon language. Some of it seems horribly outdated today. But it is interesting that Bill Wilson penned the 12 Steps, and a good deal of the narrative of what's considered the sort of core of the program, the 5th chapter of AA, wrote it longhand on a yellow legal pad and did it very, very quickly. Another reason why Father Ed Dowling felt like Bill had been sort of magically touched in some way. I'll give you a minute to read this preamble that speaks to some of the traditions of AA. The only requirement for membership is a desire to stop drinking. No dues or fees. Self-supporting. Now I want to tell you one of my favorite Bill Wilson stories about the only requirement for membership is a desire to stop drinking. He got a call. He was sitting in the office at the General Service office in New York, and he got a call from the New York group saying, "Bill, we got a problem. We don't know what to do." And he said, "Okay, what's the problem?" And they said, "Well, a man showed up at the meeting. He was a black man, and he had bleach blonde hair, and he was wearing lipstick and makeup, and he says he's a dope fiend." Right? And Bill Wilson said, "Is he an alcoholic? Does he have a desire to stop drinking?" And they said, "Well, yeah." Bill Wilson said, "Give him a cup of coffee and show him to his chair." Right? So the first transvestite African-American shows up at this meeting, and because he has a desire to stop drinking, Bill Wilson knows enough to say, "This guy qualifies, this guy's welcome." What's striking is that that was 1940 when that happened. And I tell you, I've read a lot about Bill Wilson, and I don't know how Bill Wilson got from East Dorset, Vermont, in 1895 or wherever he was born, to that moment where he was that guy, just beyond me. So, and there are lots and lots of examples of that where, and specifically because of Bill Wilson, they rejected a lot of the kinds of order and rules that caused the Washingtonians to cease to exist, and Bill Wilson rejected them. Not without a fight, by the way. This is an old text of Bill. These are the 6 principles of, that became fleshed out into the 12 steps from the Oxford group. So, here's an iteration of the first cover. That's what it looks like now. It's gone through 4 editions. The first 164 pages are the same. The appendixes are the same. The stories have changed, and not without good cause. The stories in the first edition are pretty interesting, but are really wedded to the times, and the language in them would not survive today. And so every few years they update it. I think the 3rd edition came into being in the late 70s, 77, 78. The 4th edition came out, I'm not sure how many years ago, maybe 10 plus years ago. And eventually they'll have a 5th edition. And this included people, younger people, people with various kinds of backgrounds, trying to be more current. There are arguments that the text itself needs to be updated. I think it's unlikely that they'll ever do it, just because that 164 pages of this book are considered to be pretty sacrosanct. Real quickly, I wanted to go through these steps because you don't necessarily know what they are. Admitting one's powerlessness is the core of, this is the I'm screwed step. This is my interpretation of the I'm in terrible trouble and can't fix myself step. Coming to believe that a power greater than ourselves could restore us to sanity. First of all, it expresses that you're insane, which nobody wants to do, and also believes that there's some kind of external force that can heal you. And then making some kind, I can't do this, I think someone else can, I'll let them. And those first 3 steps are the sort of the crux of recovery that alcoholics have to go through in order to be in AA. They have to sort of embrace those 3 steps. The rest of the steps of Alcoholics Anonymous are an attempt to maintain what happens as a result of those 3 steps. Generally speaking, the assumption is that you do step 1, 2, 3, you end up with what's called a spiritual experience. Now, the book says that a spiritual experience is a change in your personality sufficient to overcome alcoholism. So it's not necessarily some kind of white light experience like Billy had. And in fact, Alcoholics Anonymous around the world has lots of agnostics and atheists and Buddhists and people from every conceivable spiritual or non-spiritual background. I've always thought, I mentioned early on Ernie Kurtzer's book, Not God. And the title of that book is meaningful because what he acknowledged was that it was not so important that an alcoholic, in order to find recovery, had to find God as much as they had to determine that they were not God. And the not God part of getting sober is an important part of Alcoholics Anonymous. Remember, Harry Thibault talked about surrender and talked about deflation of ego at death. And generally speaking, alcoholics need to learn that they're not God in order to get sober. So, assuming an alcoholic in AA does step 1, 2, 3, they're having some kind of a spiritual experience. Then the rest of the steps, they make a searching and fearless moral inventory. They write it down. They write down good and bad, but especially they make sure to be fearless about writing down things that they might otherwise take to their grave. And there's a format. There are now many different kinds of formats that have been developed over the years that people use. And then they sit down with another human being and share it all. It's a pretty serious process. Then The hardest step, I think, we're entirely ready to have God remove all these defects of character. I think becoming entirely ready to have God have your defects of character removed is a pretty tough step to my mind. Especially because the defects of character that you don't like, those are easy. The defects of character that you kind of make you feel smart and cool, those are the hard ones. So I think this is the hardest step. Once you do that, then you get to the easiest step, which is to humbly ask Him to remove your shortcomings. Because I figure once you're entirely ready, humbly asking is pretty simple. And there are various helps within AA for people to keep track of character defects, pride and egocentricity and various kinds of things that are stumbling block, anger. Bill Wilson talks extensively in the book Alcoholics Anonymous and in the 12 Steps and 12 Traditions about the alcoholics needing to be very, very careful about anger and resentment. He really, I've read a lot of books in my career on the subject of addiction, and he really was able to capture some kind of elemental things about addiction that many, many authors just can't get their head around. Following that, you make a list of all the persons you've harmed and become willing to make amends to them all. And the narrative in the book Alcoholics Anonymous is pretty compelling. You become willing to make amends to them even if they're going to call the cops and throw you in jail. And every now and then you'll hear in the news about somebody who's made amends where it has resulted in them being convicted of a crime. They pay back the money. This is supposed to be a really exhaustive process where you make this list and then you make direct amends. The two rules that I've heard over the years are you pay back the money. Even if people say you don't need to pay back the money, you still have to pay back the money. And the other is you never make amends to old girlfriends or boyfriends. Because there's no way to do it where your ego's not involved, where it's not about showing people how good you're doing. And then the last three steps are maintenance steps. Continuing to take a personal inventory. Continuing to develop a spiritual relationship, to maintain a spiritual relationship, and to carry this message to others. Right? So those are the 12 steps. Before I move on, any questions? Yeah.
What is this message?
The message of
Recovery?
an alcoholic's transformation, right? Yeah. Really, the message of these 12 steps and their capacity to heal an alcoholic, to take away their compulsion to drink. So, other questions before you? Yeah.
Have you ever heard any stories about how long it took Bill to compose them?
Yeah, actually, the stories say that that there was discussions about the steps, and some of these concepts were borrowed from the Oxford group, but the actual writing of the steps themselves took he literally sat down with a yellow legal pad and started to write, and the next thing you know, the introductory narrative from the 5th chapter that includes all the steps was there, with very little editing. And like I said, if you can get a hold of the manuscript with all the editing marks on it, it's really interesting to look at. There are a couple of things. The introductory, the first sentence of the 5th chapter of this book, the chapter is called How It Works, says, rarely have we seen a person fail who has thoroughly followed our path. Now, that's not what it used to say. In the original manuscript, it says, rarely have we seen a person fail who has thoroughly followed our direction. And there are a couple of meaningful things, and if you get a chance to look at the manuscript, it's very interesting the things they changed. Interesting, you hear from both sides. You hear people critical of AA because it's a spiritual program, but I hear lots of people who are critical of AA because it's not a doctrinal program. I hear from people in religious movements who believe that AA is a watered-down church. Interestingly enough, one of the stories that I've heard, I don't know if it's true, but I've heard it enough times to believe it's true, that one of the reasons why, there are a couple reasons, why they moved away from any kind of specific doctrinal statements, any kind of reference to God per se, and staying with this God as we understood and power greater than ourselves, this kind of vague language. One was, unlike Akron, Ohio, which was seated deep in the middle of the Bible Belt, New York was full of atheists. And early on in Alcoholics Anonymous, Akron and New York were the seats of AA. And there were quite a few conflicts between the two of them, but that pressure was exerted from New York. The other was that in 1935, in the late 30s, the Catholic Church wouldn't allow Catholics to go to a non-Catholic religious movement. And I have heard it said that part of what drove these folks to change the language was to avoid excluding people based on issues of doctrine. In addition, I think the third thing was that the early AA was really in the Oxford movement. And I mentioned that these were kind of high-class folks. Well, the alcoholics who got sober as a result of their faith experiences in the Oxford groups had what Bill Wilson had, which was this desire to bring other people. And they brought a lot of drunks to these Oxford group meetings. And it would be fair to say that eventually the church people got a little annoyed. They just weren't fully prepared to have all these drunks, some of which were, loud and, smelly, and it kind of offended their sensibilities. So the fact that it ended up moving away from a traditional church environment isn't exactly surprising. Here, did you get it? Yeah.
Yeah, someone mentioned today that some of the steps might be an interpretation of the Beatitudes.
Yeah, I think there are a lot of influences, again, you can really explore this stuff. They were interested in evangelical religious movements. They were interested in Spiritism. Annie Smith was a very spiritual woman. Actually, her book collection is on display in Ardmore in Akron, and it's illuminating to see what she was reading regularly. So I think there were a lot of spiritual influences that came together with this group. Some better than others. Some, frankly, weird things. There were AA members who were into seances, and I mean, it was the early years were an interesting time for Alcoholics Anonymous, and so it grew, and they met in people's homes, and they would rent King's School, and then Jack Alexander came along, and Jack Alexander was an author, and he wrote this wonderful article that you can still find. You can Google him online and read this article in the Saturday Evening Post in, I think, 1941. And that's when AA started to explode. The Saturday Evening Post got, in a very, very short period of time, something in the neighborhood of 6,000 letters, mostly from wives wanting help for their husbands. And so they sent a lot of big books out, and AA became a national thing. And I think it was actually 1941. I think it was the Jack Alexander article that provoked the folks in Ann Arbor to write New York. There are interesting stories about AA. I mentioned Clarence Snyder, just because Clarence Snyder is proof positive that AA can survive at all odds. Clarence Snyder got sober. I'm pretty sure that Dr. Bob treated him in Akron at the hospital. He was from Cleveland. He got sober, and he, to his death, said that he was the founder of Alcoholics Anonymous. Why? Well, because he went back to Cleveland, and the meeting he started in Cleveland was the first one that was called Alcoholics Anonymous. And so he said, like I said, he died in 1984, and he said, for his entire life, he said, I founded AA. He did not get along with Bill Wilson. He got sober in 1939. He thought Bill Wilson was wrong about all sorts of things, not the least of which he felt Bill Wilson was wrong about the traditions of Alcoholics Anonymous, and I'll share those in a minute. Things like anonymity, things like not taking money. He basically openly flaunted the 12 traditions and broke them all. He took money to speak. He became part of fundamentalist church. He ultimately moved to Florida, and he would evangelize all of the people who he met in AA and took them to his church. And he didn't get along very well with Bill Wilson. And AA survived despite Clarence Snyder. But when he died, he had 45 years of continuous sobriety. How many of you know who Marty Mann was? A couple of you. Marty Mann, if you've heard of the disease model of alcoholism, you got to thank Marty Mann. Marty Mann went and saw Harry Tiebout as a psychiatrist in 1939, didn't stay sober, but Harry Tiebout had a manuscript copy of the big book, of the book Alcoholics Anonymous, and he gave it to her. And she was a scholar. And her first meeting was on Clinton Street in Bill and Lois Wilson's apartment. She got sober in 1940, and she was a first in a number of ways. She was really the first prominent sober woman in Alcoholics Anonymous. If you've heard of the National Council on Alcoholism, Marty Mann played a significant role in the development of the National Council on Alcoholism. The famous Yale School of Alcohol Studies was largely a result of Marty Mann. She died in 1980. She was 40 years sober. She was also the first lesbian in Alcoholics Anonymous. She was extraordinary and played a huge role in social policy. We really still look at the roots of alcoholism treatment in the United States to the work of Marty Mann. Another person who was significant was Bunky Jelinek. He was a physician who, any of you heard of the Jelinek chart? A few of you. Well, he was a scientist in the 1940s particularly, and he came up with this construct called the Jelinek chart. He made it up based on histories that he gathered from a relatively small group of alcoholics, such that the scientific basis of what he ended up creating, what he called the progression of the disease of alcoholism, would never pass muster today. His N was way too small. But it became part of the lexicon of treatment, and we still use it today. And it was one of those things where I think it would be fair to say that Jelinek lucked out. That he created this description of the symptoms of addiction, of alcoholism as a disease, and he could have very easily gotten it wrong. But he just hit it right, and it's held its own for quite a few years. And he was a character in a lot of different ways. So, but he played a role in advancing the development of alcoholism treatment. And so you see, over time, it started to grow. In 1950, the International Convention in Cleveland, this is where Clarence and Bill almost came to blows, because Bill Wilson had found out about the Washingtonians. And he found out about this amazing movement that had grown quickly and then disappeared. And he realized that this fellowship had grown to the point where it had to have some structural concepts to guide it, or it was going to go the way of the Washingtonians. And he got a lot of pushback. I think really Bill Wilson deserves the bulk of the credit for the 12 traditions being enacted by AA. It was not an easy process for people. And these are basically, if you spend time with these are the concepts of an anarchy. There's no one in charge. It seems like the last 6 or 8 months there's been a lot of talk about AA not working, and one of the things they do is they cite research that says only this percent or that percent. And of course, whenever you hear somebody citing AA's own numbers, they're just making it up. Because all AA does is a survey every 5 or 10 years. And that's only of the people who respond, and that's only of the groups that register. And alcoholics are kind of notorious for saying, I'm not going to register. So no one has any idea. If 3 of us here decide we're at an AA meeting, right? We have a resentment and a coffee pot. We don't need to have a resentment. And we call it an AA meeting. In the eyes of AA, it is an AA meeting. So the reality is it's a moving target, and nobody knows. People say, well, how many people are in Alcoholics Anonymous? No one has a clue. No one has a clue. I was traveling in Kazakhstan and came across a little town where there was a guy, this little man, who had gotten a Russian translation of the Big Book, and he was what we call a loner in AA. He'd never met another member of Alcoholics Anonymous. He'd just gotten this book, he read this book, he got sober. He would correspond with AA in New York. He'd never met another member of AA. But so this is, there's no membership fees, there's no, as a matter of fact, another change, it says the only requirement for AA membership is a desire to stop drinking. That used to say an honest desire, or I think honest or sincere desire, and they decided that that was too high a standard. And so they said, nah, just a desire, right? We're not going to start judging people's motives. And groups are self-supporting. One of the reasons why, though there will be national criticism about AA, you'll never hear anything come out of New York AA, it's because they don't have any opinion. They never express their opinion. People say all sorts of things about AA, and AA never responds, ever. So this is, I think this was really a charmed thing. I think Bill's work on these traditions was extraordinary. But it really is a very, very unusual organization. Nobody's in charge, nobody runs this, nobody, two groups side by side in the same town are autonomous except when they do things that affect each other. Any questions about this? All right. And this is just to show that it grows. In St. Louis, they passed the 3 legacies. 1960, I don't remember what the business was for 1960. They normally enact, or at least in the early years, they would enact something. I think the I am responsible, there's Bill's desk. I am responsible in 1965 was a greater expression of the 12 traditions. And this responsibility declaration, you'll find AA meetings where they'll actually recite this at meetings, the idea that the hand of AA is always to be there. And that was passed, I think, 65. Bill Wilson had his share of struggles. He suffered from terrible depression. He went off on, the group had to pull him back from time to time. In the 60s, he experimented with LSD as a treatment for alcoholism. Didn't take it to get high, but it would be fair to say that some of the other members of the fellowship said, we think you probably shouldn't do this. Particularly in the 50s and 60s, they explored all sorts of other things. We could spend an hour talking about the various treatments that AA groups and AA members came up with, kraut juice and Caro syrup and vitamin B shots and all sorts of, In the 60s and 70s, it was very common to have alcoholics taking regular massive doses of niacin and things like that. He was interested and curious, and some of what he tried was pretty, I think, scary. But he was an extraordinary guy. In '66, Ebby Thacher died. Ebby Thacher had a very, he brought this message to Bill, and Bill credited him and spoke very lovingly about Ebby Thacher to the point of his death. Ebby died bitter. He had periods of sobriety. He spent some time in Texas with a famous old-timer, Cersei Seed, and stayed sober for a number of years, 7 or 8 years, and then his wife died and he drank again. He really felt like he didn't get the kind of credit that he deserved for Alcoholics Anonymous, and it was, I think, a heartbreaking thing for Bill Wilson that Ebby really died resentful at Bill, because Bill really loved Ebby Thacher. 1970, you began to see the kind of size. These international conferences happen every 5 years, and they're extraordinary. These are, I think, the last pictures of Bill and Lois in upstate New York. Bill died in 1971. There he is with his regular cup of coffee. And he, you know, he struggled. He was, had his own egocentric moments. He knew he was the, you know, the founder of this great movement. And by the same token, he would visit groups and sort of sit in the back row. He'd travel around the country and visit AA groups and hope that people wouldn't recognize him. He died of emphysema, as did Ebby Thacher. They were all smokers. His last talks are his respiratory disease are pretty prominent. When I first saw this picture, this is a picture of his gravesite, and when I first saw this picture I thought, here was this guy, this legendary man who made this extraordinary contribution to Alcoholics, to the founding of this social movement, and it looks like there's 50 people there, doesn't it? Right? Well, a year ago I was there, and now I know why it looks like there's 50 people, because I don't think it could tolerate 100 people. It's a very, very small country graveyard just outside of East Dorset, Vermont. And he has a very, very simple tombstone. He and Lois are buried side by side. 1975 was Denver. Alcoholics Anonymous continued to grow. Paul O. was, I don't remember when Paul O. died, I think 2000. This is an example of somebody new in the stories. He came into this, I think he was in the 3rd edition of the book Alcoholics Anonymous. What's striking about him is that he was, in addition to being an alcoholic, he was a drug addict. And his story was a pretty dramatic shift in how Alcoholics Anonymous viewed people with problems other than specifically alcohol. And he founded the International Doctors in AA and played a fairly prominent role in helping get physicians into recovery. What else do we have? 1980, New Orleans. This is just to give you scale. Lois Wilson, who also we could spend a couple hours talking about Al-Anon. Lois Wilson started Al-Anon in their apartment on Clinton Street. She lived long after Bill and was a constant presence and corresponded with people to the point of her death. 85 was Montreal. These things, as you can see, keep getting bigger and bigger. 2000 was in Minneapolis. That's the Minneapolis Metrodome, and it's filled to the brim. 2005, Toronto, and I think I got, that's not Toronto. 2010, I've got to fix this slide, was San Antonio, Texas. 2015, next year, we'll be in Atlanta, Georgia. Anybody know where 2020 is going to be? Detroit, Michigan. 2020, the International Convention will be in Detroit. Okay, I think that's it. Time for a few questions. We're almost out of time. Yeah, in the back.
The 1955 International Convention, the 3 legacies, any significance?
Well, I can only pick and choose what. I urge you, Google the 3 legacies.
Okay.
There's 12 concepts. I didn't even touch on the 12 concepts. And go to the AA.org website as well, and there's lots and lots of literature and interesting stuff there as well.
Will it also have the 4 reasons for recovery?
That's a good question. The four points I mentioned earlier.
Right.
I don't know. If you email me, if you go to Dawn Farm's website and email me, I'll dig up a reference for it. So, yeah. Other questions? Last chance. Yeah.
There was, probably was an apocryphal story about Bill meeting William James.
Yes. Meeting William James?
Well, I thought, the story goes, and I thought it was James, but someone had told him that, he asked if there was any cure, he was told that there wasn't.
Yeah, I know the story, and it's actually not William James, it's Carl Jung. There was a story that he had met Jung. They corresponded late in Jung's life, but they never met. And that is an apocryphal story. He never met Jung. He did write Jung. They had a correspondence about Rowland Hazard, and Jung wrote him back. And I think Bill wrote him back, but Jung never saw it because he died in the correspondence. But he never actually met him.
So the story I heard was, again, I'm not sure who it was supposed to be, but seeking help, he was told there wasn't any. Years later, the psychologist said, listen, I knew about spiritual experiences, but I didn't say anything because how do you tell somebody to go have a spiritual experience? So
Oh, no, Jung was pretty straightforward with Rowland Hazard. Jung said, you need some kind of spiritual experience.
So
And if you look at Carl Jung's writings, and one of his sort of masterpiece books came out in the last 5-10 years, he was a big proponent of mystical spiritual experiences. And the whole idea of experiential learning was pretty big with Carl Jung.
So Bill never had a talk with anybody in the psychiatric profession before?
No, other than Harry Tiebout, and Harry Tiebout, as I say, talked about surrender versus compliance, and talked about this idea of deflation of ego. You know, one of the core concepts that isn't really written about, but is sort of understood in the field, is that a lot of people think alcoholism is a lack of willpower, that alcoholics have some sort of fundamental weak will. And one of the reasons I think AA works is that it understands, it comprehends that alcoholics are pathologically egocentric. Bill Wilson called it self-will run riot. He said the alcoholic is like is a victim of the delusion that he can wrest satisfaction and happiness out of this world if only he manages well. That's why empowerment psychotherapy doesn't work with alcoholics, because empowerment is exactly what alcoholics want. And what AA teaches is this idea of deflation of ego at depth and surrender. And I mean, I think AA works because it treats a fundamental core element of what alcoholism is. That's just me talking. So I love the stories. I urge you all to, if you're interested in this, contact me. Look in these books, and there's tons of literature out there. There's way more great stories than I could possibly share tonight. So. Yep, one more.
Do the philosophies and theories work the same for drug addicts as they do for alcoholics?
Yeah.
And also, the meetings, is there like a temperament at the meetings and at an AA meeting as opposed to an AA meeting? Can you?
Yeah, well, yeah, I mean, there are huge cultural differences depending upon where you go. I mean, they reflect the culture of the people who are there demographically, and you could argue that Narcotics Anonymous meetings are different than Alcoholics Anonymous meetings in some distinct ways. Yeah, they are different, but the concepts involved, the 12 steps, have ended up being translated into all sorts of, mutual aid groups. And I think because the principles translate pretty well. I think sometimes people say, well, they work because all addictions are the same. I don't actually think that's necessarily true. I think Alcoholics Anonymous as a particular kind of intervention is effective with a lot of different kinds of things. So we could spend a long time talking about that. Like I say, contact me and I'd be happy to have the conversation. So, all right, thanks for coming.